Is this on right now? Yeah. I'd really like to say as little as possible and reserve as much as possible, at least from my end of the time span for discussion. But I do want to clarify a few points. I think I mentioned that my next book is going to be called The Ethics of Evil. And there's a reason why I'm mentioning it right now, not to advertise a book I haven't written at all yet. Obviously, that doesn't make sense. But to tell you a problem that I've encountered, and that is a politics, a lifestyle, a culture based not on virtue and what is good in the world, not on an attempt to define what is virtue and what is good, but on an order of 1 to 10, operating under the shadow of evil. Example, and this was a very vivid thing for me years ago, that was the time when, after the German Revolution of 1919 to 23, that whole revolutionary period in Germany after the First World War, German politics began to take the following form. It took the form of voting for the Social Democrats to keep out the Catholic Center. It took the form of voting for the Catholic Center to keep out the extreme right or conservatives. It took out the form of voting for the conservatives to keep out the fascists, and finally Germany got fascism. That's a terrible politics. It's not only a politics, it's a way of life on an order of 1 to 10, we call it, or what is the bottom line. And I therefore oppose lesser evils and have consistently, especially since 1933, and I was involved in the movement in 33, left anyway, of opposing lesser evils. I say this all the more because I want to tell you that my enemies' enemies are not my friends. During the Vietnam War period, that is, and I was deeply active in the anti-imperialist struggle, I refused to march on any demonstration that flew the flag of the North Vietnamese. That did not mean that I supported the Vietnam War. What I opposed was American intervention anywhere in the world. That did not mean that I supported causes at all that America opposed. I therefore oppose authoritarianism in all its forms, that of Ho Chi Minh, that of Mao Zedong, that of Fidel Castro. But I also oppose the Bay of Pigs vigorously, that invasion. You may agree with me, you may disagree with me. I do not support the Sandinista regime in Nicaragua today. But that does not mean I believe that one should support the Contras. If you want to go and pick coffee there, if you want to support the regime, we can have an interesting discussion about whether or not such a regime like that is something that conforms, at least from my point of view, to anything that I regard as liberatory. I do not think it is liberatory any more than I think Fidel or anything in China or whatever you like is liberatory today. I say that to clarify something. Augusto Sandino was not an anarcho-syndicalist or an anarchist. What I know of him is more of a kind of rather wild populist. The present regime is very strongly oriented toward Marxism-Leninism. That is enough to stop me. But again, I oppose American intervention. I would fight it vigorously, black flag, red flag, or any other flag, or red, white, and blue flag. I beg you of all to bear in mind the consequences of the policies of lesser evil. And you're beginning to see it very vividly today. Many people I know, possibly in this room, but certainly among the movements, supported Mondale against Reagan. Not only do we have Reagan, but we have the Democratic Party currently chasing the tail of the Republican elephant. This is a very characteristic phenomenon. There's a great danger in that. Let us finally define what is right, what is good, what is free, and let us not try on an order of 1 to 10, to use the language of our time, to go all the way from 1 to 10, whichever you regard as worse, and finally wind up at the worst of all possible evils. I totally solidarize with people who have criticized me after the discussion for not having clarified this point. Sandino was not an anarcho-syndicalist. He was not a Marxist-Leninist either. Ortega is a Marxist-Leninist. I do not support him. I'll tell you who I do support. I support the Fourth World people. Everybody seems to be forgetting them. Okay, and of course the CIA would like to use them all it can. Happily, there are movements in the world today that don't like either the CIA, the KGB, or anything like that. These are the Native Americans, the Indians, the indigenous people, and I'm proud that the Institute for Social Ecology, with which I am affiliated and which I helped found, is now editing and circulating the Indigenous Peoples newsletter. These people I truly care for. One last thing I'd like to make as an observation. I was always a futurist in a very strange sense until I started reading Alvin Toffler and Herman Kahn. I'm not a futurist now. I think we have to step back in order to go forward. And this is just a brief rumination with you. I want to share this and then I'll shut up. And the floor, so far as I'm concerned, apart from other folks at the table, is all yours. We went wrong somewhere. This is a very important point with me. Somewhere in our, quote, civilization, putting quotation marks around that, we went wrong. The bough out of the tree, assuming that there was a mainstream to the tree, has grown out away from it. I believe that came with patriarchy, above all with the coming of the warriors. Here I think Susan is going to have something very important to say in a forthcoming work. The coming of the warriors. We went wrong. Human society is a euphemism. There were always two societies. There was the sororal and there was the fraternal. There was the woman's home, which provided nurture, which provided the warmth, which provided the support, and in the opinion of many anthropologists, provided the basis for sociation, the mother-child relationship, and also the socialization of the male. And I'm not trying to pander to any movement, woman, male, or otherwise, in saying this. This is a very important thing in my life. Then there was the man's hut. There the boys were raised to be hunters, and by the way, hunters are not necessarily killers, but they were also raised by, there's a wonderful book on that score that's been totally ignored, Paul Shepard's The Sacred Game and the Tender Carnivore, which is now out of print because it's too good. That's a good reason for putting the book out of print. You'll find that out in time. But there were these two societies, which we call one society. The warriors came. One can trace them in the Epic of Gilgamesh, one can trace them in the Iliad, one can trace them in the Odyssey, one can trace them in Joshua, in the book of Joshua, and on and on and on. There are other great junctures in history which we have to go back to and re-explore again. Terribly important that we re-explore them again, because we went wrong and now the bough has gotten heavier than the tree, and it threatens to split the tree and kill the whole society today. Capitalism, to me, is literally a social cancer. It was never progressive. Anyone who says it ever was progressive is wrong. It was sick from the word go, and it was monarchist, never Republican. Don't kid yourself about that. We are now beginning to re-look all the old revolutions, review them, and we find that that bourgeoisie was monarchist. It was not even Republican. Forget about anything else, democratic. So we have to go back. We'll not be able to go forward unless we go back and retrace our steps and find out where we went wrong. The coming of the warriors, the discovery of the New World, and with it the plundering of the New World and native peoples, and then with that the so-called Industrial Revolution, if that's what you want to call it. Marx has a statement, and I'll close on this. The past lies on our brains like a dead hand. Let the dead bury the dead. That's a big mistake. We will not be able to go forward until we dig up the dead again and examine exactly what they were suffering from that we are now the heirs to. I regard that as very important. So I'd like to close very briefly on those observations over and above what I had to say right up to that now. Thank you for your consideration on this. Well, of course, this is your discussion, and it's your discussion. I'm finished, aside from answering any questions.
Yeah, so if there are questions from the audience.
At this point, do people want to have a discussion or ask questions to the panel? I'd like to propose an amendment to the agenda, which is I could have a discussion with my anarchist friends any day, and Murray Bookchin only shows up once in a while, and I would have heard him talk for 4 hours.
I'm sorry, I just can't hear. I was a steel worker for years, and also in the tank corps, and that...
I'd like to propose an amendment to the agenda, which is I could have a discussion with my anarchist friends any day, and Murray Bookchin only shows up once in a while, and I would have heard him talk for 4 hours.
I'm sorry, I just can't hear. I was a steel worker for years, and also in the tank corps, and that did a lot of damage to my eardrums. I couldn't hear what you said, please.
I said I'd like to hear you talk more.
Answer the question.
I have so much to say that I just cut out a little segment to talk with you tonight. I can tell you about nature and freedom. That's another fascinating thing. It's blowing the mind of some of my ecological associates and also some of my comrades, if you like. I hate that word already, in the radical movement. But I don't want to go into these things. There's too much to be said.
Yes.
I'd be interested if you would talk a little bit more about the kind of language that you think we need to start using. I feel a lot of affinity with what you said about that spirit that's there, that goes very deep in our mythology and in our culture, that a lot of people on the left have always dismissed it, and the Reagan-type people have been able to pull that into their camp. If you would talk a little bit about the kind of language that you see.
It's a big kick of mine. Does anyone want to discuss that here? Because I really don't want to monopolize this. In fact, the last time I spoke, I turned it into a town meeting and merely moderated it. That was out in Santa Cruz. You'll remember that. Anyone want to say anything on that? Because I have a big kick about that problem.
Don't mean to throw this over in an area that, could comically be called Indianola. But have you heard many Native American people speak? The style of their address and what they tend to talk about? Things like spirit power and Mother Earth and that sort of thing. That seems pretty indigene to me. And it spreads out. Native Americans all over North America talk that way. It's a worthwhile source. If you're wondering what is the root spring of Americanish, the root spring of Americanish is Native American.